My brothers and sisters, our good news has been recorded for us by Matthew. No, it's not. Keep you guessing. There's only 3 others. It actually comes from Mark. Jesus summoned the 12 and said to them, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers over the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones make their authority felt over the others. But it shall not be that way among all of you. Rather, whoever wishes to be great among you will be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you will be the slave of all. For the Son of Man has come not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." The gospel of Christ. Praise be to you, O Christ. Please be seated. So last night, Donna and I attended the decommissioning of the Huntington Yacht Club. This is, the end of the season, and so they have a ceremony that actually sort of closes down the boating season, for the year. We very much appreciate and like going there. The folks there are very nice and very warm and very welcoming. And of course, being the pastor and the chaplain, I'm fleet chaplain for the yacht club, folks come up to me on a regular basis and they share with me what their needs and their concerns are, their anxieties. It'll come, I'll be standing at the bar and someone will come over and nudge me. And then before I know it, like their head is right here, and telling me, what their concerns are. And I'm okay to that. And I do promise all those that I promised to pray for yesterday, here today, that I will do just that. But the one question that came up a number of times, and I guess it's related to all the activity that is taking across the world in the Ukraine and of course in Israel and Gaza and Hezbollah and all that, and why can't there be peace? It seems simplistic, and probably is in its statement, but there really was a common consensus over like 4 folks that were talking. They simply wanted to know, why can't there be peace? And it made me thinking, all throughout, the night, and when I said my prayer yesterday too, I talked about that. I shared with the group, as right before meals, they asked a fleet chaplain to say grace. And I talked about how, the one common thing that all of you were talking about was the need for peace, and that somewhere in the midst of our lives, we actually move day by day without really recognizing that we don't have peace, that by watching, the news causes enormous amount of anxiety and stress. Everything we're hearing about, people, relationships, the horrible event that just took place here with the murder-suicide here in Eastchester. All of these things are disturbing, to a community. And ultimately, I think, to our country and to the world as a whole. And they asked me, why do you think that there's no peace? And I said, I think it's because we're always trying to be better than the other person. We're always trying to be in a better position. We're trying to be stronger than the other person. We want to have more opportunity than the other person. And this language resonates all throughout us, right? Students are called students, which means that there's a teacher. Employees are called employees because there's an employer, right? I mean, the list goes on and on and on about how in our society we have structure. And that structure is sort of just innate, and we don't think about it, but it really does put people off, and it does designate one person over another. If I use the word migrant, automatically there is this reaction we have that they're not us and we somehow are better than them, even though the vast majority of our parents probably were migrants when They ended up coming to this country in the first place, but we were out of that. We've moved out of that realm, and so we're in a better place, so to speak. And so it really does come down to a type of competition we have with one another. The thing I love about the Gospels is that it reminds us that 2,000 years ago, this same stuff has been happening. Humanity is humanity. We're flawed. We're broken. For some reason, a lot of us find our value in our titles, in things that we have accomplished, in things that make us stand out. And it's not to say that we shouldn't be happy about our accomplishments or even respected for our accomplishments, but does it really make us all that much better than someone else? I'm not really sure. I do a lot of Zooms and Zoom meetings because my whole world is Zoom. I just sit there and I Zoom from one country to another to another. I get around pretty much a lot in the course of a week. And I can't tell you how many times people don't know, what to call me, because the title on my little Zoom thing, on my little box that I pop up on, my little name on the bottom is, Reverend Eric J. Hall, and then I have Doctorate of Theology and Advanced Placement BCC, right? So it's BCC. And they say to me all the time, what do I call you? And I'm like, Eric? And they're like, really? And I'm like, yeah, Eric's fine. Like, that's what I am. I'm an Eric. I mean, my parents chose to give me an Eric, and I'm an Eric. And, but because people see the title, automatically they're posturing and maneuvering, trying to make sure that they're not offending you. Why? Because the vast majority of people, once they have titles, they want to be called by those titles. The story that this goes with, right before this section in Mark, you have James and John. James and John are disciples of Jesus. They've been with Jesus a long time. They have listened to Jesus. Jesus has talked to them about his death, about his suffering, how this is all going to happen. They're wandering along, and they come up to Jesus, and they say, Lord, we have a request we want you to grant. And Jesus goes, sure, what's the request? Grant us that we will sit on your right and on your left in the kingdom. Now, I personally think James and John are thinking that Jesus is still this messianic warrior who is going to overthrow the Romans, and they're going to take back Jerusalem and in Israel, and as such, then they would have a place. And they're vying for that. Why? Because if Jesus is the king, then anyone in close proximity of that person, right, has more recognition and more value than other people. They simply come up. And Jesus then goes into this response. What you're asking for is what the Gentiles do. It's what everybody else does, is what Jesus is saying. Ultimately, for you, if you want to be the first, you have to be the last. Now, I don't know about you, but that grates against me, because now all of a sudden you're saying that despite my gifts, talents, abilities, whatever, I'm somehow supposed to allow all of that not to be my identity. And that's what Jesus is saying here. Don't make it your identity. Find your identity as being a servant and a carer and a provider and someone who is compassionate to others. That should be your identity if you're going to be a follower of mine. And I think it's really intriguing because, like I said, we live in a society that we give ourselves names and brands and titles all the time. I have yet to meet anyone who has titled themselves servant, and has done so willingly and excitingly, that I want to be the servant. Please let me do everything I possibly can for you, and don't worry about it. No one. It goes against some of what is ingrained in us, and yet 2,000 years ago, the challenge is still the same. and the command from Jesus is the same, and I don't believe it's meant to be a haphazard Passover, it's something Jesus said, isn't that nice? And then we skip it and we go to something else because it makes us too uncomfortable. The fact is that his audience and those two disciples and all the disciples, especially the other ones, when they find out that James and John were trying to get better seating, than they were, it all goes poorly. Doesn't some of this sound like what happens in work and in workplaces and in the workforce, where people are vying for, titles and prestige and the best office seats and everything else. When I came out of the monastery and I ended up working, I remember in my mind saying to myself, wow, as CEO of an organization, I get the corner office. And I remember sitting in the corner office going, now what? It was a nice office, but it didn't make or break me. But I'm sure maybe for some people, it does. The part I want to focus on as I close is this whole thing about sitting on my left and on my right. Because I think Mark here is reflecting something that everyone would have known about Jesus' life and ultimately his death. The Gospels talk about Jesus being crucified, and on his left and on his right are hung two thieves. That story would have been very popular as Mark is writing this, because Mark is writing this about 30, 40 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. I want us to consider that could it be possible that the seat of being on the left or the right of Jesus is really and has already been filled by those two thieves that hung on his left and on his right. That God has already selected those two people without titles, except for that of being a thief. Only one repentant, the other one lost in his own world of misery. And yet, there as Jesus hangs upon the cross, there are these thieves that are on his left and on his right. These would not be the people that you and I would select to be next to Jesus at a moment in time like that. And yet it is exactly the people God had selected to be at his left and at his right. And I'm wondering if there's not a lesson there for us. That maybe it is about accepting and embracing our brokenness, not to try to cover up our inabilities and our shortcomings by chasing after things that just externally give us some type of credential or ability. Maybe it really is about becoming the servant, but that is more of an attitude of who we are. It's simply an attitude of how we are meant to move through life. See, I think you can be a CEO or a president or whatever, and yet still be that servant inside, that your heart is naturally drawn to caring for other people. And I am just really astounded by the fact that Mark would try to make this correlation between his disciples, his faithful disciples, both of which, by the way, James and John were not at the foot of Jesus. They abandoned him in his crucifixion. And the people that God chose to accompany Jesus as he died, were these two individuals that none of us would suspect had a proper place or should have had an invitation to be there in the first place. If God thinks this radically different, if God acts this radically different to how you and I see our lives and our world and our objectives and our goals, it just simply means that we need to do a lot more work to become more like the mind of Christ. And maybe peace in our world really does start with us not allowing ourselves to buy into the package that we have to be better than everyone else. We have to be right and they're wrong. That we have to use titles, migrant, Democrat, Republican, whatever, to put people down and to keep them in their place because we somehow are better than them. Maybe this is really what Jesus is talking about, that there has to be this mindset change. And the reason why the world is where it is today, and it hasn't changed much in 2,000 years, is I think because we look at these words of Jesus and we pass them over as a really nice saying, and I don't think Jesus was asking. I think Jesus was telling us how to be. God bless you.